All right, so we're a small but extended crowd. All right, so as economists, right, we always have to have slides to talk to you all. No slides today. All right, so Seth and I are going to be the dueling economists today. All right, you've heard the dueling pianos. We're the dueling economists. We've kind of set up what we think is a back and forth discussion of some of the issues we think are important. But given the small crowd here, we're small enough that let's take questions as we go. It's not so much us knowing everything that needs to be talked about. So if we say something you don't agree with or have a further view on, I'd much rather take those as we go. I'll say, so Seth and I have known each other for, I was going to say years, but I could say decades. All right, in different capacities. I don't think there's going to be that much we disagree about in terms of some of the important economic issues, but we again kind of want to have that back and forth, if you will, with you for the next 2.5 hours. All right, hour, all right. Making sure everybody's still listening to us this morning. So again, so Scott Brown, I've been at the University of Missouri for 30 plus years. I sometimes now say I'm the old guy. I'm just waiting for them to push me out the door one of these days because I've gotten beyond. And Seth, I'll let you talk a little bit about your situation right now as well.
Yeah, so I'm USDA's new chief economist, and they said at the start of 2020, it's actually the start of 2021, so I've been there a little over a year. I think the important thing to make note to you, we'll talk about a lot of subjects today. I'm not a political officer at USDA. I report to the secretary like the undersecretaries who are confirmed by Congress, but I'm not a political. Years ago, they moved this position from being a political position to being a career staff position. So just the point of nothing you're here today is going to make policy. I inform, and policymakers make policy. The other thing I'll tell you is tomorrow is WASD. So nothing you hear today you should think that it hints about what tomorrow's crop report is going to say, because I don't even talk to my crew for about a week before that report comes out. So, and you know, because they'll fine tune things, they'll pull that information off in the morning. So I think we can have a robust discussion. You may see, hey, why don't they have a bunch of slides? I think this actually makes me more nervous than giving you a bunch of slides. So I really would appreciate some Q&A. This is where I learn a lot more about what's going on. And my post is in DC, but I'm staying in Columbia right now until they decide they want us all back. So I have a slight DC perspective by way of Columbia, Missouri.
So I think as we kick off this morning, so we have a list of a few things that we think are important to talk about. We've kind of divvied those up between the two of us to make sure that we highlight some of the issues. So feed costs certainly is one that I think we have to talk about. And to me, it opens a whole gamut of discussion, and I asked Seth to lead that with us as we start this morning. Where do you see feed costs for the remainder of this year? You know, what happens? What are the critical things that pork producers in particular should be paying attention to from both corn prices and soybean meal prices? Where do we go?
Yeah, so this goes a little bit back to a discussion about 3 months ago with the secretary. And I don't think the theme has changed. It's more to the price levels that we're operating from. So about 3 months ago, I took some sample corn and soybean budgets from central Illinois and talked to the secretary, talk about input prices. And we could talk more about input prices in a general sense if folks want. But kind of laying out here, hey, you know, there's the potential for a return squeeze. And I think my point would still be, hey, normal weather is going to give us lower prices following harvest. But we're at stronger price levels now than I thought we would be several months ago. Okay, so we've raised prices for the current crop folks are marketing. That probably means there'll be risk onto the next harvest. Probably this summer we'll get a weather rally at some point, perhaps. And I think we were in a downward trend when I went to talk to the secretary about 3 months ago. Commodity prices had come off their peak and they had started to fall. You note my crew at USDA went out there and said, hey, here's some problems with the Argentine and the Brazilian crop. Okay, we're going to put those into place. We've seen some effects already, even though it's somewhat, you know, we're still in the mid-range of some of the crop in some places. So we've seen some trouble with that crop, and we always assume normal weather going forward after that. So I think when it comes to feed costs, what we're experiencing now is a pop in prices somewhat related to that dryness in South America. Still expect after harvest, if we have a normal crop, that we'll see moderating crop prices to some extent. I mean, if you're a crop producer, we're in the crop insurance price discovery month right now. So looking better than it might have looked a few months ago. So again, perhaps easing prices as we get out past harvest from where we're at now, which are pretty strong prices.
So a good corn crop, a 15 billion bushel corn crop in the bin this fall. What should pork producers think about prices?
I mean, absolutely. I think the point being is that barring some kind of drought, barring something else, we should see softer prices after harvest. I mean, I think that's a natural. We're on pretty strong prices now because of a South American supply concern. Demand remains pretty good, and so I think we'll see some softer prices after harvest.
And if you think about soybean meal, so I often get hit about renewable diesel, and do we at some point see cheaper soybean meal prices going forward? And I go, what's the story here? Because yet when I look at the current WASDE for the current year, soybean meal prices are still fairly high. What happens over the next 12 months?
Yeah. I mean, I guess I would argue that at USDA, there's this issue of renewable diesel. You see when we have our soybean oil supply and demand balance sheet, and you look at it, you've got year over year about a 25% increase in the amount of soybean oil going into renewable fuels, about a 25% increase. And you all have seen that this has really pushed up the oil value in the bean. That's what's driving crush and meal, and that's our long-term perspective on this as well too, which is some of this demand coming from renewable diesel is going to push that meal price down, and it's going to keep it down relative to the oil price for the foreseeable future. Even then, you talk about the price that we're expecting for that. I would say we're not even as aggressive when it comes to some of this soybean meal, the renewable diesel use as other people are. A lot of people would say we're actually fairly tame or tepid on this. When you look at the number of renewable diesel plants that are on paper, it's huge capacity. It's enormous. But the truth is, I want you to recall back in about 2007, we had as much ethanol capacity that existed as was under construction and on paper, right? So we had the same amount being built that we had. And so you would have thought we would have doubled capacity in a year and a half. It took years for that capacity to come on place because the economics shifted. And I think from our standpoint, the economics of this shifts. So while we are not overly aggressive, I think we're in the right place. When it comes to soybean meal, do we want to jump into where those plants are at?
Yeah, absolutely. Jump in.
So part of it, when you think about meal, and let's put this in a Missouri context as well too. You all know that renewable diesel is different. It's by its nature different than your traditional biodiesel production. These plants are big. They're huge relative to a traditional FAME plant that you have here in Missouri. They are located, if not inside the gate of a refinery, right next to the refinery. So the dynamics here of where that oil is needed is completely different than traditional biodiesel. And the economics of producing renewable diesel are better than producing traditional biodiesel. So you've got a change in politics here where these plants are all going to be located on the coasts with huge plants. And so I worry a little bit about the internal crush within the Midwest where, if you look at a map, it is stark. Traditional biodiesel plants in the United States, all across the Midwest. Renewable diesel plants, all on the coasts and refining areas. And I worry how it changes the dynamic of, do we crush, move the oil, keep the meal? Does it change where crush happens in the U.S.? I think that's part of the issue.
So I have a question. So the question before Seth jumps in to answer is relationship between crude oil prices and things like corn prices. The idea is there a relationship that's going to hold going forward, and maybe you're prompting that with what's higher crude oil prices today might keep corn and soybean prices higher. Seth?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's always this long run relationship that to me is not directly tied to ethanol or these things. I mean, we've got a policy that intervenes quite a bit. I mean, the RFS for how we can discuss it all you want, but it kind of breaks those direct linkages. But there's a lot of indirect linkages with increasing costs, increasing demand, inflationary pressure that brings along interest in commodities, all of those things. So I think what I don't want to predict, if we continue to have higher petroleum prices, yeah, that works its way back into commodity prices in a very general sense. And maybe more directly a little bit corn, because you have that added benefit of, hey, I'm bringing down I'm making that corn ethanol a little bit more competitive. But it's not the only one, right? It's not the only relationship there. And I think from the RFS standpoint, we have a bigger issue here, which will bring me back to meal and oil, which is, when they pass the RFS each year, this one is actually, I don't know how much you follow it, but this is actually an aggressive increase for this year if they ever finalize the rule. The truth is what happens in the short run is it's hard to consume that extra ethanol. We tend to consume additional biodiesel in order to make up for what we can't consume for ethanol. And that is also another reason we continue to see this wedge between oil and meal prices. So I think that's another sensitive area where they set those limits at.
Other questions relative to feed costs? Don't be bashful. This is a small enough group we can have this conversation. Because if not, we're going to move on. Yeah, jump in.
So there's two. This is the government, right? So there's a couple different answers for this. It's not transparent, right? Exactly. So I think the one difference is this issue we've had with small refinery exemptions recently appears to have been resolved, and that's why I'm saying 2022 looks like it's an increase in use, because in the past several years it's been reduced by the small refinery exemptions, and that issue seems to have been resolved. Now, the issue, important when you all think about meal prices here, I think, is that the legislation is silent after 2022. It's silent after this year as to what those levels are. EPA has to come out and say what that long-term prospect for this is. Right? So therein you're putting the future in the hands of these folks who will make some longer run decisions. And what role will biodiesel play? How much oil is available? What are we going to do with the meal? Can we consume the meal domestically, or we end up exporting it if we push up crush enough? So I think there's a lot of things coming down the pike which kind of touch on this. But I think even on the other side of that is, what does demand look like? I think everybody thinks that gasoline demand side of this maybe falls over time. I'm not sure the same holds for diesel over the next decade.
All right, so we're going to switch gears a little bit and talk about some of the processing issues that we see in the industry. So maybe a little more, the rest of this conversation, directly related. I will say, I look at what's been happening in the early part of 2022 here, and I look at what's been revisions in daily slaughter, especially on the hog side, and what have we been seeing. Those original numbers that USDA has been giving us about expected slaughter, so their communication with plants has generally been to reduce those over time, revisions. So plants didn't hit what their intended target might have been originally. And to me, the idea is we are seeing labor be an issue as we've started early 22. I think Omicron has been part of that, as plants haven't been able to run at the capacity that they would want. Now, I didn't say full capacity, right? Even just the capacity that they want has been part of what started us here in 2022. As I think about plant issues going forward, the coordination that's going to be required between how many hogs we bring to the plants and what they can handle is going to be more and more critical. All right, so I remember the old days when, Glenn Grimes would always say, is there a shackle space to hang that last hog? And the day there isn't, that's the problem. And now I go, well, it's more complicated, right? It's not only do we have the shackle space, but do we have the labor to make sure we utilize that shackle space to the full extent? And I don't think that goes away anytime soon. We can talk about COVID's created some of this issue, but I don't think we get over those labor issues too quickly as we move forward. And so this coordination is going to be more and more important, because if we bring too many hogs to be slaughtered in a given day, what happens? I think prices could go down. You get pushed back. You say, sorry, we don't want to see you today. And yet, building another hog processing plant today, I don't think is on too many folks' radar screen, because how do I make sure I have labor to run that plant? I say thank goodness for the pork industry. We built a lot of capacity over the last 5 or 6 years. Had we not had that capacity, we'd be in a much worse shape today in terms of moving forward. So as I turn to Seth, I'll turn to the $1 billion that President Biden talked about in terms of meat processing and modernization, specifically to the pork industry. What do you see as opportunities for that $1 billion in terms of new investment?
Okay, and I do think it's incredibly important here to distinguish between cattle and hogs, because we can talk about cattle if you like, but to me, cattle, you described this situation about having sufficient cattle and sufficient capacity to move those animal numbers. We're in a different situation or have been in the different situation on the cattle side. So when I hear folks at USDA talk about this $1 billion, and when I think about this, I really think about two different buckets for this. Some of it more related to the cattle side, which is, hey, are there regional issues where you can say, hey, we need a little bit more capacity, we can increase the number of bids a producer gets, or increase the revenue a producer generates, or what their contract looks like. And so this isn't a national capacity issue, right? This isn't going out and building a bunch of capacity at a national level to be able to, and then support that capacity, because it costs money to keep that capacity there. So it's more of, there are maybe regional issues, and we see that particularly more in cattle, but in the hog side, there are regional issues. But then there's a separate bucket out there that I think explores, that may not necessarily be, again, on the radar for capacity, but it is more an exploration of ownership structures. It's more of an exploration of producer ownership structures that capture, they'll market their animals in a specific way. They'll market the product in a specific way. Is it an ownership structure, co-ops? Is it niche production? And by niche production, I mean, this isn't really about commodity pork. It's about some kind of specialty product or a branding of a specialty product. So I think that those are the two buckets, and it may be that second bucket that is more appropriate in terms of ownership structure for the hog producers.
And that second bucket might get out in terms of being used. Any timing you would share with the audience in terms of that?
Yeah, so I think that this will be, hey, let's move quick on some of these ideas. I do think that there'll be at least some emphasis on the big money for cattle. I don't think hogs are not going to be left out, but I think that we're talking weeks to months, not months and months and months till this starts to go. I think there's an interest in getting a certain amount of the money out the door. Continue to take applications, look at what are the ways to spend that money, and then make some choices.
Questions related to processing?
Well, then I'm going to keep talking if they're not going to ask questions. Questions? Do you guys want to? I think that labor here is an absolute issue. I think at USDA we have some real problems when we think about processing issues, because we identify, are there folks out there that know how to haul animals? So trucking, and maybe trucking in general, but trucking specific to ag. And so we're trying to work out programs, how can we support some of that? And then also on meat and poultry processing, slaughter, just in general. I mean, I think to your point is, folks tend to have in their mind capacity as being a physical plant. That's not the constraint now. That's not the constraint. You used to, I think, even say, and let's talk about, you can swing on Saturday. I think when you hear packers talk now, it's like, if I make them work on Saturday, they don't show up on Monday, and I need the efficiency is, I don't want to I need that Monday, I need that full run through, not try and squeeze out a few more days on the Saturday side. And so I think absolutely labor is a constraint. I don't see an obvious point at which that changes in the near term.
So yeah, go ahead, ask away.
Is there any way, like on the processing industry, that they can make incentive for people who want to come to work there, like
Well, an incentive. Tell me more about what you. I mean, clearly clearly the wages for labor has increased pretty substantially there, but it's increased across the board. I think, the challenge here remains, we were talking about this, you were saying it's like, 20-something at a meat and poultry processing plant, or just a little bit, 10% less than that at something that's a lot easier. I mean, so you're just seeing wages need to increase to get people in the door.
see like some, like the trucking companies and stuff, they're all short on labor too, and they're putting out different motion type things to get people to come.
And I think you see the Packers doing this as well too. I mean, some of the Packers, and it's interesting stuff to me. So you'll have some of them offering, hey, we'll give anyone in your family tuition to a local community college if you come work for us. Okay, I mean those are incentives which might be very interesting to the folks who are the pool of employees that come to some of those slaughter plants, right? Local community college for my kids. Okay, I'm gonna stick this out. My kids are studying at the local community college. I think you find them struggling with this, right? They're already increasing wages. They had trouble. They're always scrambling for labor before this. This has only exacerbated the problem that they find themselves in terms of labor, right? And I think to the point of this, I don't see what the obvious answer of this is, and so it worries me because it's a continuous constraint, right? We saw during kind of this spread of this latest variant of COVID, we had a little trickle down in overall slaughter numbers for across the board by all animal types. Kind of watch it, and it kind of came back. Okay, good. But labor continues to be a constraint, and I don't know what changes that in the short run. I think a lot of folks, when you look at it by age group, I think a lot of folks that have come out of the labor force are on the older end of this, and everybody's kind of moved up. It's a good time to be a young, sharp person who wants to be employed, but those are the folks that you're kind of pulling them out of there. So they're going to have to compete with wages.
I think we look up in 2 years, and we have the same problems we face today.
Yeah.
Getting beyond maybe the worst of COVID does not fix this. And to your point, you have to create an incentive that is greater than competing work alternatives. And right now we know that's a tough road because everybody's wanting labor, everybody's pushing their own unique set of what they think are their unique set of opportunities for folks to come to work for them. Yet I think the fundamental issue of not having enough workers in total is going to be with us for the foreseeable future, which what's that mean for margins? Margins from farm to wholesale probably only widen. They don't get less. I don't say that saying, that's what I want to see happen, but I think it's one of the critical issues. Costs for us generally in this industry from slaughter to setting in the supermarket or restaurant are not going to go down anytime soon, even post COVID-19. Correct, but you just see, even today, right? So we've been offering incentives and we're not really getting more labor. And so to me, the pressure's still for higher costs going forward. Yeah. We're not done with what happens, and we're going to see, I think, a lot more stories about farm to retail margins keep widening. And again, I'm not saying I like that story, but I think it's there.
And this kind of gets back to this capacity, which is those are tough jobs, right? And we can talk about ownership structure and things on a small scale where those folks, you're processing in a maybe a more niche production, special, but that's not capacity. That's not a huge number of animals. You still have to deal with this issue of labor on what is tough work.
Yeah. Will?
$800 a month, nobody wants to work. They want to sit at home and get that check in the mailbox.
So I hear you, and I don't disagree with you. I will say, when you look at, though, the number of folks engaged back in the workforce, there's less of that going on than was the case a year ago. And I think even if we were giving no money, there's not that many people sitting out there that would re-enter the workforce. Your point is well taken. You take that money away and you're going to give incentives. I've got to go work. But I don't know that pool is as big as we might like to hope it would be. And sometimes I'll actually say the other end's happening. Those of us nearing retirement are doing what? Well, maybe it's not so bad to go ahead and get out and retire.
And I think that's what my comment about being somebody, being a young go-getter. This is the time to be the young go-getter, because when you look at some of the age breakouts, it's some of those older folks who might have lingered in part-time, or they're saying, hey, my financial situation, my cash flow is pretty good. The risk of returning to the workplace, I don't like it, and they're out. I mean, so I think from an age standpoint, and then that's pulling everything up from that point as well, too. You're pulling everything up. Those folks are exiting the market. A lot of skills, a lot of resources kind of disappearing because those folks are retiring, and it's pulling everything else up with it. Retired folks?
No, the ones that don't want to work.
Yeah, I think that's part of it. Don't get me wrong. I mean, we can talk about that being part of it, but I do think that you've got a tight labor market in part because the older folks not returning to the workplace is also putting a pinch on this. I think that's part of it. When you look at the demographics of who's exited the labor force.
And to go one step further, to the folks that aren't working right now, that I go, is their first alternative to go work in a pork processing plant? Or do they have some other alternatives if they have to go find a job that they're going to do before they go get in a pork processing plant?
You drive down into any town and every business has a want help. I don't care where you put hamburgers or driving a truck. They need help and they can't hire help.
And all I'll say is that's not going to change anytime soon.
I disagree with your older people, your retired people. They're having to go back to work just to make ends meet.
So it depends on the situation. I'll say generally, I think if you looked at the data, you'd find a lot of older people that are exiting. Those that have retirement opportunities seem to be taking advantage of those opportunities right now. But to me, I don't think we fix this very, very quickly.
Yeah.
This is not to take issue with you, but I'll be 63 next year. And I would say what the point you're making needs to be dropped down. I've got several friends that were all now 40 years in our career, 35, 40 years, they've retired.
Yeah.
In the last 18 months, they've retired. To his point, my mother-in-law is 82 and went back to work a couple months ago at a local small shop making $18.50 an hour, because she said that $18.50 an hour, I used to work all week for that. Now, she just was excited to have something to do for $18.50 an hour. You come back 18 or 20 years in my age zone, these people are taking a 401k and running to the Ozarks. And it's a real strange dynamic, because the older group, some of them need to go get the income, and some of them just try to get $18.50 an hour.
Well, we should calibrate. I'm just a little over 50. I don't consider myself a young guy, so I'm just so you know. So I'm with you, which is it is exactly these folks with a lot of skills.
His point's well taken. These are weird dynamics.
Yeah.
You got people who have been like 40 years that are saying, I'm out of here.
And so correct. I will say the dynamics are all over the board. We can't really put a bow on exactly what's going on. However, the bow I will put on this is it doesn't fix itself very quickly. So you're right. Maybe there is opportunity for some who will say, I'm more than happy at $18.50 to come back and work part-time. The ones that have retired that come back. But I go, I don't think we can, without really driving wages up even further, we're going to get a lot more total employment going on.
You don't have a lot of longevity in that new hire.
Yes. So yes, and an issue we face is, and I'll go back to pork processing for a minute. The 80-year-olds aren't going to be there, right? And so we have to find the younger crowd that wants to work in a pork processing plant. I think that's going to struggle. All right, so we could talk about this all day. I appreciate the conversation. I want to move us on. We have to talk international trade at some point. I often say, you know, if you talk anything trade related, you're right 70% of the time if you answer China, right? So let's have a little bit of discussion related, you know, to China. Is looks like to me the Chinese are going to take less pork. USDA reporting now for 2022 a reduction in overall imports of pork into China. The last WASDE that we got, I think, or the one before it, no, January WASDE would have reduced U.S. pork exports this year nearly 500 million pounds. And a lot of that, I think, would be related to China. What do you see first in terms of what happens in China as we think about both the supply side but also the demand side of the pork industry there, Seth?
Well, so when you and I talked a little bit about the demand side, and I think your point was, do consumers come back to this product? And I think that, you know, when we struggle with, you know, so we don't do just pork when we're looking at this. Obviously, we're really looking at the grains and other sides of this. So we're looking at, wow, look at the expansion of egg production. Look at the expansion of aquaculture. Look at the importation of some products like beef. And so I think your point about maybe consumers have decided they like this variety. They like the mix. Maybe we don't see a return to those same levels of consumption, I think is a fair one. I also think that maybe when we think about the conversions of feed and other things that slows a little bit as well too when we think about the importation of soybeans. Still continues to happen, but maybe we don't see the same kind of demand growth that we've seen in the past. Maybe we don't see a full rebound. You're right. Now, but we can get into this. The other thing that we talk about anytime you raise China, you also got to say, but we totally lack transparency into the Chinese market. They don't share information, and it's not getting better. It's getting worse in terms of sharing information by China in the marketplace, and that works to their advantage.
So it appears a sow herd that's rebuilding. There's still some risk of ASF growing there yet again, so that could create opportunities perhaps for us in the U.S. But generally, we've changed what it looks like in China for pork consumption long term?
I think that we've continued. So I think in the near term, we were already down a bit year over year in terms of overall pork consumption. We've not consumption, already down year over year in terms of overall importation. We've cut that importation a little more in the short run. But that's going to be a mix of what we're trading with them, what they're producing domestically. So I don't want to put this all on a consumption side for trade.
Yeah. All right. So when we think about ASF, it's hard not to talk about it without saying United States. USDA's efforts there on ASF.
Yeah, so I think USDA is, and this is, you know, this is the APHIS folks and the other folks, but you can see lots of planning in place. Boots on the ground in Hispaniola, so Dominican Republic and Haiti. Boots on the ground, try to understand this. Planning against it, trying to figure out how to respond, keep it from happening, and then if it happens, how to respond. And, you know, when we get questions on this very issue, when I get questions, it's tell me if the incident was occur, how it was to occur, where are we talking about in terms of regionalization that the last speaker was talking about? Is it someplace in a wild herd, or is it someplace where there's a density of commercial hogs? But the first step is to try and keep it from happening. You got somebody waving.
Jump in.
Yeah, so you mentioned in your talk on China about maybe shifting, you know, to fish or something else other than pork to compensate for the expense of pork and having imported. In recent years, we've been hearing more and more about plant-based protein. Where do you see this going? And how much of an impact do you see that
Are we talking? Yeah, this one's maybe for you. For China, I don't know. What we saw is you observed that when they had to, pork got very expensive there. You saw them diversify into eggs and other meats and fish and these types of things.
Yeah. So here's my quick 30 seconds of what I see. So number one, there's a segment of the population in this country that wants plant-based alternatives. Why would we not give it to them? They likely aren't consuming meat anyway, right? They're likely already anti-meat. So that's not a bad win for us. Now, this opens a whole other can of worms of, is there combinations of plant-based product and meat-based product that get thrown together in some new demand category? I often see some blends that might work very well in some cases. Not that we might like them from a pork perspective or a beef perspective. If those plant-based alternatives are out there saying they're better than beef or pork, then we have a problem, right? So if we can work in conjunction, I sometimes say all of a sudden we have those plant-based alternatives filling a niche that otherwise wouldn't get filled. Yet if we're going to compete and say one's better or worse than the other, that creates uncertainty for consumers. And I'll say, for me, the average consumer in this country is not very well versed about beef, pork, chicken, plant-based alternatives. And so they're easily, I was going to say misled, maybe that's too strong a word, but it's hard for them to sort out the facts from those stretched facts, if you will. And that could create some issues. You know, I think this technology continues to evolve. We get better plant-based products out there. But I will come back to say, right now, to me, they're hitting a segment that probably wasn't going to consume meat anyway. And if you look at some of the companies out there doing this right now, I go, the economics haven't been very good for them. They started very good, but they've kind of plateaued off and went down, which tells me it's hard to grow that demand side for plant-based alternatives beyond those that would already want that product because they aren't consuming meat anyway.
I thought it was going maybe in a little bit different direction as well, too, in terms of, hey, you know, when you start talking about better than, right? So are we talking about environmental concerns? I was down, I guess we're south of there now. I was up in Jefferson City yesterday, you know, and the secretary's talking about, they announced this $1 billion for climate smart commodities as well too. And so I thought maybe, you know, one of the things here is exploring some of these ownership structures, going back to meat and poultry processing, slaughter, tying it back to producer ownership. Some of the investigation we're doing in my office and some of the incentive behind these climate smart commodities is, how do you build up the market for some of these activities like, hey, no, this meat product has a very low GHG emissions. And so therefore, hey, we're going to label this, as USDA, I kind of think about this process. I'm a markets guy. I kind of think about this program the secretary launched yesterday as being like number 2 yellow corn. All right, we all know what number 2 yellow corn is. We can all agree what number 2 yellow corn is. Can USDA participate in that area and say, okay, we're going to study this, measure this, bring down the transaction costs for folks to be able to produce a product that they can then, hey, we all agree that this is what its environmental profile is because your consumers want it. And therefore, can we build this change? What are the legal necessities? How do you compete against plant-based products, maybe on other issues in terms of environment? And so I kind of think that these climate smart ag programs and the meat and poultry processing money works to say, what do your consumers want? Because I know you want to sell it to them. What do your consumers want? How can we as USDA agree on what number 2 yellow corn is? So what these production practices do in terms of greenhouse gas emissions, and agree to that and build that market. And not only here in the U.S., I think, you know, they keep talking about the CCC funds and 5E. I'm getting into the details, but that's about domestic markets. But this is also about foreign markets as well, too. You want to sell high-value product overseas. Maybe your consumers overseas also want to see that linkage back and say, okay, I'm mostly concerned about the environment. Now I'm going to evaluate this plant-based product against this pork product, and I can enjoy what I want and still achieve my other objective. So I thought maybe that's where we were headed.
Will?
Seth, just going off what you said there, if you can market a product that says it has a lower carbon footprint or whatever, do you think that would eventually open up markets like, in Europe that don't accept?
So I think that there's two aspects of this. It's the first front mover ones. I lived in Europe for a while. So if we can determine, hey, let's put the science down there that works for us before the Europeans lay one out there that suits the Europeans. So I think that's a good thing. I think we can learn a lot and develop some of these standards that are respected. Folks will say, hey, I understand and I believe this standard. And so I do think part of this is this move overseas as well to say, hey, we're going to offer this product. Now, I think you also heard him say repeatedly yesterday, which I think is interesting, voluntary, voluntary, voluntary. If the consumers want it, let's figure out how to facilitate a market which allows these folks to sell that product to them. Right? If your consumers are demanding it and they're going to pay you for it, how do we facilitate this market? And to think about that, number 2 yellow corn is, and I'm using this as a crutch, as an example, but it's like it lowers the transaction costs because you and I all agree what number 2 yellow corn is. If you and I can all agree on what the GHG reductions are of that practice, hey, we've lowered the transaction costs. That means producers can potentially benefit more from that transaction because right now all of that benefit gets eaten up. When you think about these climate programs, all those benefits get eaten up by all the verifiers in between, right? Can you bring down those transaction costs so that you can make this a better for the producer? So I think that, and I expect there will be livestock programs which will be funded out of this. I expect that.
All right, so we've kind of gotten fair ways into our hour, and so I want to start a little bit of wrap up if we can, and again, I hope you all will ask questions related, but I'll start this way. So for me, supplies of meat in 2022 are going to be lower. We're going to produce less pork. We're going to certainly produce less beef this year. The drought in the west, the drought in the northern plains, drought that's tending to now extend into places like Texas and Oklahoma, to me sets in motion much lower beef supplies coming forward. Don't forget, we came through a period of time where we had abnormally strong growth in overall red meat and poultry production. That all kind of stopped in 2020, and we've just been coasting down to sideways in terms of meat supplies. That's nothing but good news from my standpoint for prices. We aren't going to supply too much to the marketplace. But the next piece of that is demand for beef and pork have been incredibly strong. What changes that? Is it a risk? Or do we continue to see, I always say, we need a lot of bacon, right? Because we have to wrap that chicken in something. All right? But I go, what happens if bacon demand were to go down? All right? So it's not a scenario I care to have to talk about, right? Because I know that's lower prices. I also then go, what happens if we create new demand for things like pork loin that I think have struggled with in terms of moving what used to be our premium product is now replaced by bacon. And why do we like bacon so much? Because it's got taste, right? And that taste comes from fat. All right, so I go, if all of a sudden we decide that's unhealthy, and I go, consumer trends, they cycle. So to think we can just continue to march along, I just plant the seed of make sure we're thinking about that. So for me, demand's the tough part, and I will say now to COVID-19. So if you back up to the beginning of COVID-19 and you pressed an economist, they would often say recession, shuttering the economy, we're worried about the downturn. And all I'll say to that is you can put enough stimulus money out there to offset, in the short run at least, economic downturn. But if you look at the forecast for this year, disposable income, real disposable income that's basically flat, does that, at record prices that we're pushing at consumers today, slow down demand in 2022? That's not what we've seen. Everything's been incredibly strong right now. But if I have a risk that risk is that demand starts to slow in this country because supplies, again, are in good shape. We know that. That's almost a given at this point. But for me, it's the demand side, and does it continue as strong as it has? Seth, I don't know what that opens up that I didn't cover, but jump at it.
No, I think it's great. I think that if we really look through on some of the scanner data, I think you're starting. So I think it's a risk. I don't know how big of a risk is, but let's talk about what some of the potential is. Because I think if you look through some of the grocery scanner data, you start to see, hey, maybe some of these high prices are pulling a little bit off the top in terms of volume. All right. You know, when you kind of try to get back yourself into what the volumes are, maybe you're seeing some of these high meat prices pull you back a little bit. I'll remind you all to our earlier conversation here, we had really high disposable income in 2020 as people stopped doing other things. They really enjoyed some of these products. We also had additional SNAP allotments in terms of folks all across the income spectrum being able to purchase additional foods. We've made some changes in the Thrifty Food Program with respect to USDA. Do we see some folks pulling back because of price? Tell me what happens to disposable income. But is that same demand spark there? Because you're right, it's been phenomenal. It's been what's provided that extra layer on here that's really kept prices solid in terms of in terms of hog prices. I think for cattle, we've got other issues.
All right, so we're getting to the end. So one thing I'll jump in and say, all right, so Congress, right? Congress needs to do some things. What happens February 18th? That's important to you all. How about LMR reauthorization? Do you care about that? So what happens if Congress chooses not to reauthorize LMR? Do y'all remember 2013? Didn't markets struggle for a little bit trying to go, how do we price pork without LMR? Now, I didn't stand up here today to say we're not going to see LMR reauthorized. However, unrelated to us in pork, but to the cattle side, I see some folks who want changes in how cattle are priced or cattle price discovery that might hold LMR hostage, LMR reauthorization hostage, trying to get done what they want done in the cattle side. And I just remind you to think back to when 2013 unfolded and the government shut down and we weren't reporting mandatory prices, what that meant to the industry. I don't want to overplay that hand, but February 18th is not that far away. And even going a few weeks without LMR is not without challenges about how we're going to price product, in my mind. Seth, I don't know what else you have.
You make a compelling argument, but I think we'll do business. I think LMR will get passed, and so what I think what Scott's describing is the cattle side's pretty contentious. I mean, the pork side, I think everybody, but on the cattle side, it's very contentious, which is strange because I think everybody thinks that, hey, mandatory price reporting for cattle is a good thing. I mean, no matter where you are on this spectrum of the packers' margins and how those are coming about, everyone will agree LMR is a good idea. Maybe we should expand LMR. So AMS is out there putting out some new reports trying to say, hey, let's cut the data some different ways. You know, is there more we can do about information symmetry between producers and packers? And so I think that no matter where you are when it comes to cattle and some of the issues with packers, everybody thinks LMR is a good idea. But you're right, the problem is it's kind of like the farm bill, where if you don't have a farm bill, you go back to the base rules, which nobody wants to do. And so I think LMR sits in that same position, which is weird because I think everybody agrees, hey, our LMR is good, can be enhanced, and is part of the process. Whether you think that minimum cash trade in cattle is a good idea or not, everybody still thinks LMR is a good idea. I'm optimistic, but I guess I'm going to be optimistic that gets done.
So perhaps if you care about LMR, now's the time to be talking to your representatives, your members of Congress, to make sure that they understand from a pork perspective that's important for us. Even if we're going to have these struggles relative to cattle. I'm not sure how quickly we take care of some of the cattle pricing issues that seem to have cropped up over the last couple of years, but you don't want to let that drown out your voice relative to your interest in LMR. And maybe some of you go, I don't care if LMR goes away. Yeah, go ahead.
So, help explain that to me with what they're wanting to pass with the cattle deal there. They're talking about having like a 25% of the market minimum be priced on the open market every.
So cash trade.
Cash trade.
Every plant would have a trigger of you've got to buy this many cattle in the cash market on a regular basis.
So my question is who decides who gets put into that and who gets to still have a marketing agreement?
Yeah.
That's where my question is, because I can see this, if that goes through, getting pushed farther into other industries as well. And so where the decision in my mind is who decides, well, whether you're going to get stuck with the cash market if you're going to be allowed to have that marketing agreement that you dealt with in the past?
So a few things I'll say. So number one, I think you're wise to think about this from another commodities perspective, because how many hogs do we cash trade today? Yeah, very, very, very few. So 2% or less. So I go very few. Yet, do we talk about issues of price discovery in the pork? So we talk about them. All right. So the difference for me is cattle generally is now saying, well, cattle, depending on where you are in the country, is saying we don't have good price discovery. And they cash trade already a lot more cattle yet today than we do in hogs. And I think there's some regional issues going on there. We don't cash trade very many cattle in the southern plains. We cash trade a lot of cattle typically in places like Iowa, et cetera. How much cash trade do we need in these industries to have good price discovery? All right, and so let me make sure I define price discovery. So do we find the intersection of supply and demand? Do we find the price that clears supply and demand? Is it the true equilibrium price? That's about price discovery. And I often say better price discovery does not guarantee higher prices. It guarantees we're finding the correct equilibrium price, so we aren't seeing someone paid too high or too low for those cattle or hogs. I think we're going to continue to grapple with this issue because we keep getting bigger, and it's everybody. It's all segments getting bigger there. I think when you look at what cattle's suggesting here, every plant will have a mandated requirement of how many cattle they need to buy off the cash market every day. I sometimes will say cash negotiation costs money. Having AMAs sometimes makes it an easier transaction. That doesn't mean we shouldn't cash trade enough to make sure we're, again, finding the right price, but mandating particular levels can create unintended consequences. And I think there's the problem of how do you go partway down this road of I want to cash trade more cattle or I want to cash trade more hogs without running into other constraints you didn't anticipate, because there aren't very many packers on the other side of this ledger, right? And if those packers can take advantage of the situation, do you think they do? Heck yes, they do, right? They're going to take advantage where they can. I sometimes say, you take the big four, though, they don't like each other very well, right? So if I'm one of the big four and all of a sudden I'm doing something where I'm not paying producers enough for their cattle, what do the other three do? They come in and bid a little bit more. So even with just four of them, there's some check and balance. Now, if there's non-competitive behavior going on, we need to fix it, right? So I'm not saying there isn't non-competitive behavior. I often say that's not an economist's ability to answer. We need lawyers. We need the Justice Department working on those things. So I'm very much riding the fence about what's the right strategy, but this is a very complicated issue. If you think that it costs more to cash trade, how do you get those that are doing the alternative marketing arrangements to subsidize the cash trading? You know, so I've seen these market maker programs that some economists are talking about that would essentially, hey, take a little bit of money from those AMA traded cattle to subsidize more cash trade. So you pay those cash traded cattle as one alternative to mandating cash minimums. That's not straightforward as the right answer either, but again, we're going to keep grappling with this issue of how many hogs, how many cattle do we have to cash trade to get good price discovery. Do not stick your head in the sand that this is only a cattle issue.
And I guess I just add, I'm not going to, so there's a lot going on in this space. And I'll just say, to me, this reminds me, we get asked to evaluate a lot of proposals. This reminds me of evaluating tax proposals, which is the details here are incredibly important, and implementation is incredibly important. So I find it to be a hard discussion to have unless you tell me what your details of implementation are. I mean, this is like a tax plan, which is the only people I know that make money are the estate planners. That's the only people I know for sure, right? So it's like that situation, which is I can envision, is this a big deal? Is this not a big deal? Does this have really large unintended consequences? Does it just kind of keep us from further eroding cash trade? Is that what the people are guarding against? Implementation here is important, and I see a lot of stuff floating around, and it's hard to evaluate.
So, yeah, one more question, and then we're going to wrap up. Go ahead.
How much impact what's the role of the current administration in the next farm bill discussion? How much do they impact what the next price supports for a lot of traditional programs?
I'll take the general and I'll save the specific for Seth to pick up the pieces. So I'll say that the change that I've seen in my lifetime of working on farm bill legislation is the administration has generally played less of a role than I would have seen back in the 80s and 90s. Because oftentimes you found the administration being the first one to lay a farm bill proposal out there, trying to guide it. You saw a lot more proactive to Congress. And so that's not this administration, it's just over time, administrations, I think, have been less in front of the farm bill discussion, and it's been more handled in Congress. Now, do not kid yourself about the conversation that goes on between administration and ag committees in farm bill debates. There's a lot that goes on in terms of making sure that those ag committees are thinking about all the issues. The administration holds so much data relative to how programs are working today that they very much inform that policy decision. It's just in a policy debate. It's just in a different way. So instead of leading like I might have seen in the 80s and early 90s, now I see Congress really taking a much stronger role. For me, the 2023 Farm Bill debate, we're a long ways from the finish line. And what it looks like at the end of the day, I don't think we really know. Midterm elections might matter here, right? What are the Democrats in control of the House? If you listen to the prognosticators, are likely the Republicans in control of the House, maybe control of the Senate. So all of a sudden you have a mix in who's in the majority, and then what policies do you want to go after? Seth?
No, I think you're exactly right. You go back through time, and there's been 3 people that have had my job before me, and you go back into original Keith Collins, and Keith and folks in USDA producing guidance of the administration on the Farm Bill. So sitting out there and laying out a framework for possible ways that you can change the Farm Bill. I think one of the other differences, so you've seen that dissipate over time. Again, lots of discussions, but not weighing in on certain aspects of this. I think that's probably particularly true when it comes to Title I commodities. And by Title I commodities, I'm talking about triggers and other aspects of this. So I'd say that's part of it. So I think that there's a less engaged, less upfront saying, here's the way you should lay this out in terms of those traditional Title I programs. But I would also suggest here the last Farm Bill that came through was more evolutionary than revolutionary, right? It wasn't, let's just throw this one out and let's go with something completely different, right? At least when it comes to the Title I commodities, so some of these programs. So, what is the role of USDA in talking about what some of these triggers are for payments? Maybe there's less of a need for that, of setting exactly where those triggers should be, and maybe Congress has a bigger role in that. if you think that it's going to be evolutionary and not revolutionary again. Because I think historically this last Farm Bill was incremental changes were historically very small, relatively speaking.
Yeah. And I think it'll still be don't mess with crop insurance, right, for example. And that'll drive, I think, a lot of what we might think of as traditional commodity programs. But do we pass it in 2023? Do we do would we do an extension? How many economists do you see as we've done farm bills? We started with the first year and we scratched it out, and we put the second year and we scratched it out. Between now and getting to the finish line, I think there's a lot of turns in the road left to play out. So.